It was in May of 2008 when reports in Frederick, Maryland, of strange, cloaked figures began to pop up. At first, it was a piece of local intrigue, and then eventually, 911 calls by startled locals began to pour in. What was known at the time was that these people were furtive, secretive, and almost exclusively seen at night. Their faces were veiled by the large, drape-like hoods on their identical cloaks. They were rarely alone. Almost always they could be seen in small packs of 5 or 10, walking down a dark alley near Church Street, or, on the rarest of occasions, scurrying quickly across Market Street in the dead of night to go from one unknown location to another. None of this would have been so alarming if the figures had been accounted for, but there were no groups of role-players, cosplayers, costumers, or religious sects who, even when pressed, would take credit for them, nor did their garb resemble the uniform of any other known organization. They were described as always wearing cloaks of dark blue, almost black, but they shimmered as if partially metallic. When spotted, they seemed to glimmer slightly under the moonlight in ways that felt unnatural for clothing, whether velvet or satin. Yet no one described the cloaks as looking like any sort of leather or latex either, more like living skin. For most, the presence of these characters was more of an amusement and local puzzle than a menace. Although some tried to pin a batch of missing persons cases on the strange group, there simply was no evidence of any criminal wrongdoing. And anyway, such cases had been on the rise seemingly everywhere. People seemed to only spot them a couple times a week on average, and there were no associated reports of assault, theft, or even vandalism. Only one oddity was left behind in their presence: a smell. Everywhere the cloaked figures were reported, a pungent and potent fishy odor would linger, sometimes for a day or more after they had left an area. In fact, this particular aroma was the only thing that seemed to prove their presence beside eyewitness testimony. By September, complaints had become so common that local police made a statement, which has since been redacted for other reasons, that advised the public to not call in regarding the figures unless an actual crime was observed. Without the urgency of a warrant or crime reported, police had so far not questioned any members of this strange affiliation. Upon arrival to the scene of a complaint, the mysterious figures always had already left in directions unknown. It was unclear at first who these figures were, but Jeremy Collins, a writer for the Frederick News Post and amateur scholar of all things paranormal and occult, began to investigate them. At first, his investigation was based more on curiosity and interest than on dread or meaningful concern. It would make a fascinating story if he captured the first excellent image. It was in late September of 2008 when Jeremy found himself patrolling the side streets around Patrick and Market between midnight and 2, the place and time of which the hooded figures were most often observed. His closest friend at the Frederick News Post was Virginia, a reporter like him, but she specialized more in science and the arts, rather than the broad local reporting that Jeremy did. He would often ask her to join him in the thankless job of walking during this late hour. It was an unseasonably warm evening. Jeremy wore a blue t-shirt and jeans. Virginia walked with surprising energy considering it was midnight on a Tuesday. She seemed to bounce on her sneakers and wore a faded red sundress. They had parked on Market Street but now found themselves farther east than Jeremy usually trudged. "Do you want to play 20 questions?" asked Jeremy. "Not really," said Virginia. "It could be about medieval history." "Jeremy, I would literally rather talk about anything else," Virginia laughed. "Look, I know this must seem boring," said Jeremy, finding himself jogging a bit to keep up with Virginia's admirable pace. Jeremy's legs were already tired, but this must have been an easy trek for a marathon runner like Virginia. "But after walking around this area night after night for almost 2 weeks, always hoping to see something, I don't know, it gets a bit lonely. I also want to say thanks for coming with me tonight and for driving us here." "Well, no problem," said Virginia. I don't like the idea of you biking so much at night. I've seen you trip over your own feet. And Jeremy, to be honest, I don't really care that much about these people. It's probably some community college dropouts who thought it would be fun to scare people into believing there was something more interesting going on in this town besides antique shops and Civil War memorabilia. I at least want to get a picture, Jeremy said, tapping the camera that hung around his neck. It's unbelievable that no one has even gotten a picture of these guys before. Apparently they tried, but they always slip away too fast. Or they don't exist, said Virginia. The temperature was dropping even as she spoke. It's like one of those mass hallucination things maybe. You know, one person insists they saw it, a few more people pretend that they did, and eventually, lots of people start seeing it because they're expecting to. Like the Loch Ness Monster, only with shiny cloaks instead of sea monsters. Virginia laughed mockingly. They continued to walk together. Jeremy imagined that the mix of boredom and anxiety must be how beat cops felt in bad neighborhoods. The occasional breeze was refreshing. The peaceful silence was broken by a sort of grunting noise. It sounded almost like a bark, but somehow frog-like. Jeremy and Virginia paused to listen. Virginia expected to see some strange breed of dog poke its head around the alley corner that they were walking through. "It's nothing," began Virginia. "Quiet," blurted Jeremy in a harsh whisper. He slowly swiveled his head to see the back of the alley that they had been walking from. Then she saw them. There were 4 figures standing tall and narrow, with dark blue cloaks cascading over their bodies and obscuring their faces. Jeremy suddenly felt grateful that the area where he and Virginia stood presently was shrouded in darkness compared to the well-lit area that illuminated the figures. They heard the strange guttural noise again that wasn't quite speech or belch. There was no doubt that it was coming from the cloaked figures, only this time there seemed to be an answer. The strange grunting noise was some form of communication or signal. With only the intuition of sudden panic, Jeremy grabbed Virginia and put one hand over her mouth while pulling her with him to a narrow crevice behind the nearby dumpster and out of sight from the figures. "No sound," whispered Jeremy to Virginia as he released his hand. They were in a safe position, Jeremy deemed. Virginia wasn't sure why they both seemed to feel afraid of people they had expected were probably pranksters. Anyway, even if the men came this way, they would simply walk right past the pair without even spotting them. They both waited patiently. Time passed, and there were no footsteps, no scratch of boot on dirty pavement. Jeremy saw Virginia twist her face in revulsion, and a moment later he realized why. There was that infamous fishy spell. It had come on so suddenly, but it was far more intense than Virginia had ever heard it described. Jeremy grasped his nostrils and tried to hold back the queasy feeling of wanting to vomit. It was like rotting fish mixed with something else, something unfamiliar. And there was the gurgling, grunting sound again. Only this time, it was right next to them. Only the dumpster they leaned against shielded them from what Virginia now thought of as creatures. She noted that even with her athleticism, it would be difficult to flee without tripping in the dim moonlight. At last, the smell began to subside from the pungent intensity that assaulted them minutes ago. It was still strong and lingering, but it seemed the cloaked figures must have continued moving and traversed the rest of the alley with barely a sound. Curiosity had overtaken his caution because Jeremy suddenly shifted out from his hiding position and crouched into the center of the alley. He saw the bluish backs of 2 of the cultists about to disappear out of sight, having indeed passed them and now about to leave the alleyway. He knew he was about to lose sight of them for good. Instinctively, he snapped a photo. Oh crap, oh crap, oh crap, no. Jeremy's heart dropped. He had left the flash on. After a quick brilliance of artificial illumination, he heard again, far louder than before. the snarling, wet, grunting sound. This time, it seemed to certainly come from more than one of the figures, even though Jeremy could still not see their faces. Virginia stepped up on the dumpster near the base and poked her head over just enough to see Jeremy turning around and beginning to run. His camera dangled around his neck as he jogged. The four men gave chase after him. They were incredibly fast, even by Virginia standards, but they hardly seemed to move their legs. In fact, Virginia could not even hear footsteps, despite the fact that they moved fast enough to be sprinting. It was almost as if they rode atop segways. Oh no, Virginia mouthed to herself. They had caught him. In the dark, she could only make out the silhouette of the figures overpowering and restraining her friend. At last, Virginia jumped out from her hiding spot. "Let him go!" she found herself yelling. They were already dragging Jeremy by the upper body away from where she stood, until her heart dropped as she saw the bluish-black hoods turn towards her. Their faces still shrouded, but she felt their eyes upon her body. "Run, Virginia!" Jeremy began to yell until his voice was muffled. With practiced urgency, Virginia did just that. She turned and ran. She managed to make her way out of the darkened alley without stumbling, then turned left towards East Street. She slowed only enough to look behind her. In horrified amazement, there were the four figures closing the distance quickly and with a demonic gracefulness. She still could not see their legs, but it was almost as if they were gliding. Adrenaline pumped as she ran down East Street with torpedo-like speed. She felt beads of sweat rivet as she sprinted harder than she ever had before, even as she heard the sloppy, snarling sound behind her and smelled that rotting fishy odor. At last, she turned the corner onto Market Street, and although they could no longer be seen when she looked back, she was sure they weren't far behind. Finally, she found her car parallel parked. With quivering hands, Virginia scrambled for her keys and got in. As she pulled out of her space, her side view mirror was ripped off as she haphazardly swiped the next parked car. She pressed her foot heavy on the gas as she tried to catch her breath and wiped tears away from her eyes. Days had passed with no sign of Jeremy. The officers Virginia had filed her police report with both looked as bemused and skeptical as Virginia had expected. The police told her that they would do all they could, but most missing person cases never got resolved. They even showed some suspicion by the lack of details she could offer about the hooded individuals. As she thought about it, it was rather strange that never once was she able to make out a discernible detail about their faces. It wasn't pitch black out after all. Back at the news post, she sensed that others were keeping their distance from her. She even overheard two of her colleagues gossiping, with one supposing that Virginia had killed Jeremy and hidden the body. Fear, frustration, and guilt continually overcame her. She spent her time after work posting signs, writing notes, and calling everyone she knew in the area to keep them on alert, as well as share her crazy story. Virginia gave herself a sardonic smile when she realized that even in the internet age, there wasn't much else she could do beyond what one might have done for a lost dog. And it's not as though Jeremy had a microchip GPS under his skin. None of that mattered much to her. Jeremy was out there, and somehow Virginia felt that he was alive. There had been no ransom note, no blood, no tracks to follow. It was like he just vanished. But she knew he was somewhere, breathing, waiting to be rescued from what Virginia now openly called an insane and demented cult. Virginia was called into the chief editor's office and given an assignment. It sounded like a typical puff piece. Interview the CEO of some new biomedical startup in Frederick and try to make the town look as glowing as possible. Virginia knew enough biological science to know that society was on the cusp of gene therapy and stem cell therapy becoming everyday applications. After making another plea to share her missing person post on Facebook and a couple more calls, she headed out to her appointment with the apparently up-and-coming entrepreneur called Alex Tendrin. As she pulled up to the headquarters of Biotendrin Corporation, she marveled. She had always known the structure to be an old factory, long abandoned. It was now renovated, reinforced, and had the veneer of chrome, security, and modernity. The old trees and shrubs that had littered the lot were gone, and the old 5-story building looked more like a laboratory or government installation than the historic structure of Frederick that Virginia knew it to be. The gate opened for her car, and she was guided to her parking spot by a young man with perfect teeth wearing a white polo, who led her inside. The entire facility was sparkling clean. Everything seemed to be made of glass and steel. It looked like how Virginia imagined a freshly built hospital. She was taken to a large office where a tall man in a well-tailored maroon suit stood up from his desk and smiled at her. She shook the CEO's hand, who spoke with zest. He looked handsome and young, except for streaks of silver in his hair. Actually, Virginia found his age impossible to determine. "We're so pleased to have our headquarters here in Frederick," he said after some brief introductions. His voice was warm, but somehow hollow, like a pre-recorded holding message. "Biotendrin Corporation has been around in its current form for only a few years, but we like to think that we stand on the shoulders of giants. As cliche as it sounds," he chuckled. "Let me show you around." The youngish man put an arm over Virginia's shoulders. Virginia tapped on the audio recording app on her Galaxy phone. "I'm going to record us if that's—" "Stem cells and gene therapy are part of what we do," Tendrin interrupted. "But we're also taking a cue from the animal kingdom." "What do you mean?" asked Virginia. "A pufferfish reacts when threatened, right? Many animals play dead." "Yes," said Virginia. "It seems that humans are the only ones who, when faced with a predator, are foolish enough to hide or simply flee, with only 2 legs to carry us." "How does this affect your research?" Virginia asked with careful word choice. "I'm glad you asked," said Tendrin, guiding her into a room at the end of a metallic hallway. "At Biotendrin Corporation, we believe animal defense mechanisms can be so powerful they can be used to ward off illnesses on a cellular level, even to fight off internal threats like cancer cells or influenza." He pointed to what looked like numerous vats with plastic coverings. "In here, we're developing a new species of potato beetle." "Potato beetle?" mused Virginia. "Yes, they excrete a powerful toxin that makes them inedible to predators. We've genetically engineered the beetles in these vats to produce a compound so much stronger that even a tiny amount on the face could cause permanent blindness and even corrode metal. Don't worry, the beetles in these vats are heavily sedated, and we've engineered them to not secrete their toxin until stimulated." "What are those?" Virginia said, pointing to green vials on a shelf near the sealed vats. "Those are actual distillations of the toxin itself. Go ahead, take a look, but be careful not to drop one," Tendrin laughed just before his cell phone rang. "Excuse me, I need to take this." Virginia couldn't make out the deep voice on the other end of the phone as she tried to read the indiscernible writing on one of the tiny green vials. "Ahead of schedule, then," Tendrin said. "Sounds good. We'll be there soon." Virginia turned back to him after examining the vials on the shelf. "All this kind of stuff seems more useful to animals," Virginia said. "I don't get how a pufferfish translates into cancer research, or for that matter, how venom of any kind could be therapeutic. I mean, it's not like you can get a human to react like a stick insect, or change into a semi-liquid like a sea cucumber." "Well," said Tendrin, guiding her out the door and further down the hall, "you've got to start somewhere, right?" He smiled. "Actually, one of my favorite defense mechanisms is that of the hagfish." "Hagfish?" asked Virginia. "You mean the slime eel?" "Precisely," Tendrin explained with gusto as they continued walking. "The hagfish has only lived in particular oceanic regions, but thanks to our research, we can modify them to thrive even in somewhere simple, like, hypothetically, Frederick's own Carroll Creek." "That's interesting," said Virginia. "I was going to ask as well, What kind of red tape is there to get past what I imagine is a lot of restriction on how you do this kind of thing? Tendrin paused. Well, one of the great things about networking is knowing how best to persuade those who make the rules to see the light, so to speak, and embrace a bit more freedom. Industry cannot thrive under the anchor of bureaucracy. Our research has only been possible in Maryland relatively recently, and you can quote me on that for your newspaper. He laughed amicably. But then why Hagfish? Asked Virginia. You see, began the energetic man, the hagfish is often considered an eel, but it's actually far more ancient. Very little was known about them before our research, except that they have incredibly strong yet supple skin, and they possess what is arguably the most miraculous protection of all. Slime? Asked Virginia, with some disgust. Yes, slime, said Tendrin, but not just any slime. Massive quantities of slime in dense concentrations that expand upon leaving their body to many times their original volume. This mucus we call slime contains fibers with tensile strength stronger than titanium. It's so slippery yet sticky that predators can't even keep them in their mouth, and when they do, they choke on the ooze. You seem pretty excited about all this, said Virginia. But how is eel slime going to help with medical research? Tendrin's face looked momentarily scornful, even as he continued to smile. We've already begun work to modify the ooze, the hagfish's excretions, to be even more useful. On a molecular level, the slime they produce contains compounds that can be manipulated to be harder than diamonds. Think of the self-defense applications. Thanks to gene therapy, this can even be applied to humans. Think of it. The end of assault. The end of violence. Tendrin led them to an elevator that descended into a second basement that Virginia didn't know existed under the old building. The halls were less well lit, and the chipper-looking assistants in white polo shirts she had seen on the first level were nowhere to be found. At the end of a long hallway, Tendrin scanned his badge and placed his thumb on a print scanner next to a heavy-looking metal door that slid open with a loud huff. Sorry, it's a bit dark, I'm afraid, said Tendrin. The experiments we do work better with less light pollution. Go ahead, step inside. I'll switch on the overheads. Virginia walked into the darkness of what she could vaguely make out to be an empty rectangle of a room. There seemed to be something reflective before her, as though the wall ahead was mirrored. The light switched on, and Virginia spun around to see behind her the heavy metal door slide close with another loud huff and an electronic clicking sound that Virginia intuitively knew was a lock. Tendrin was not in the room with her, and after banging on the metal door, she realized that someone else was in the room. In front of her, behind what seemed to be a wall of glass, was her friend Jeremy. He sat with his wrists and ankles strapped to a metal chair bolted to the floor. Jeremy was barefoot, but wore the same shimmering blue-black cloak as the figures who had abducted him, only the hood was pulled back. He looked sickly and pale. His skin had a grayish-blue tint, which seemed to shine and glisten unnaturally. There was a circular hole in the wall behind him, about as wide as a manhole that appeared to be lined with brick. Next to it on the wall was a lever, a green handle. The rest of the room was empty, except for Virginia's sickly-looking, befuddled friend.
We've done many experiments,
came Tendrin's voice, blasting in Virginia's head over loudspeakers that she couldn't see.
But none of them have been nearly so successful as your friend, Jeremy. My people were not looking for him that night you two went lurking around, but he has already been a boon to us.
Virginia looked on in horror as a bewildered Jeremy seemed to become more aware and make eye contact with her.
We have many test subjects that can now move as quickly as sea snakes. but we've never been able to bestow the powers of a hagfish onto a human until now.
"What the hell is this?" said Virginia. "Why are you doing this?" She ran to the glass and began banging on it with her fists and then kicking. The material flexed and wobbled with remarkable rigidity, like an ultra-thick plexiglass.
It's quite simple,
Tendrin's voice said again.
All animal defenses start with some kind of stress stimulus. Gene therapy can only create the necessary window of time, but it is not by itself enough to awaken a new defense mechanism in an organism. You have to expose the creature to massive quantities of pain and fear. Your friend Jeremy now has protective qualities that would make even a hagfish feel envy. But we're only halfway through his transition. Only his body has been transformed. His mind is still his own. He's not yet ready to wear the cloak and go out into the city to find more test subjects for us.
Virginia kicked harder against the glass, slamming her entire body against it, but without so much as a scratch.
Virginia, I admire your tenacity, I truly do. But you're still not appreciating what you're about to become a part of. Think, no more fatal car accidents. Instead of airbags, a thick layer of modified excretion could temporarily bind to the skin, protecting the passenger, even from the pain of impact.
"No," shouted Virginia. "You're insane. This is insane. Let us go. Let us go, and I swear, I won't say anything. Just please, let us go." She began to choke and gasp. "What's happening? I can't breathe."
You are the key ingredient, Virginia, to Jeremy's final transition. You see, with the cocktail of drugs and gene therapies we've given him, well, it takes physical stress to change his body. But in order to transition his mind so that he becomes one of us, so that he can be trusted to go back out into the world, he must undergo severe emotional stress. Humans are the only species for which most of their defense mechanisms are emotional. With the temporary nanomachines in Jeremy's blood, there is now only a brief window of time where such emotional stress will transform his mind. The portion of the room you're in is airtight. With you being Jeremy's best friend, seeing you suffocate by lowering the oxygen levels slowly is just the right emotional stimulus for Jeremy's will to crack. It always does. Once that's done, we will release him into Frederick's lovely Carroll Creek using the suction tube you see behind him. We've only sent regular, albeit modified hagfish through it so far. Your friend will be the first hagfish-human hybrid to use it, but soon it will be an easy transport for our aquatically inclined colleagues. After all, they can walk around on land, but it becomes rather uncomfortable for them to stay dry for more than a few hours. I do hope you understand, Virginia, that I'm telling you all this as much for Jeremy's benefit for when he becomes one of us, as I am out of courtesy for you. Remember, Jeremy, your memories will not change, just your desires and inclinations. You must pay attention now. Soon you will feel happy. Jeremy, now completely jostled out of his stupor, sat and saw Virginia struggle helplessly. She was now on her knees, gasping. She began to grope at her pants pockets, scrambling desperately for something. Jeremy's skin began to ooze the slippery, luminous slime of a hagfish, but he could not free himself from the straps despite struggling and shaking maniacally. Virginia saw Jeremy begin to cry as she choked more violently now. At last, Virginia took something out of her right thigh pocket. It was a small green vial of the toxin. She had instinctively snatched it from the shelf in the beetle room when Tendrin was on the phone. She pulled off the rubber plunger that was the lid. The smell was intense and nauseous. She vomited violently, managing to not spill the glowing green liquid. With a single swipe of her arm, she splashed it on the glass in front of her. A speck of it must have splashed back on her right index finger because
She cried out in pain as she felt the acidic material quickly burn through her skin, cauterizing its way down to what felt like the bone. In front of her, the glass steamed and melted with a horrible burning stench. Virginia felt herself retching again. Then there was the cracking sound of glass breaking, and a hole suddenly formed. Air instantly filled her lungs again. Despite the horrible odor, she breathed it in gratefully as the hole continued to expand with the disintegration of the glass. She heard Tendrin's voice again over the loudspeaker.
You do not understand what you're doing.
Her experience jumping hurdles suddenly mattered as she dove through the narrow hole, rolling to the side, just next to her squirming, mutilated friend. He was now covered with the oozing slime he had already started to release from his pores, but his face looked hopeful.
I didn't think I would see you again,
Jeremy said, his voice croaking painfully, like a frog struggling to talk. We can catch up later, said Virginia, undoing his straps, adrenaline numbing the pain on her partially melted finger. Jeremy stood up on wobbling legs. Suddenly, the iron sliding door from which Virginia had entered opened, and Tendrin stormed in with a uniformed assistant on either side. Each of them had handguns that they now pointed at Jeremy and Virginia.
What are you waiting for?
Barked Tendrin.
Shoot them both!
2 loud shots quickly followed his command. With surprising and unnatural speed, Jeremy grabbed Virginia by the shoulders and spun them around so that his back blocked the path of the bullets, which flew through the now enormous hole in the glass. With a froggy grunt, Jeremy was pushed forward as though 2 hammers had been thrown at his back.
Virginia,
croaked Jeremy.
We need to back into the wall. Pull the lever.
Jeremy took steps forward as Virginia took steps back, like a macabre waltz. More bullets were planted into Jeremy's back. He grunted in pain but did not fall over. Once in reach, Virginia pulled the green lever. A whirring sound could be heard coming from behind the wall. It sounded like an air conditioner starting, but 1,000 times louder.
Hold on to me tight,
Jeremy said,
or you'll die.
Virginia felt Jeremy's slimy arms wrap around her, and as if on command, a fresh, new layer of slime oozed out from his skin and enveloped her whole body, except for her mouth. It took only a few seconds. It was translucent and liquid, yet somehow felt as thick as cement. A second later, Virginia lost all sense of time and perception. She felt the sudden rushing of water all around them, the pool of intense suction and pressure all over her body. It felt like being born. She intuitively knew to keep holding her breath as water continued to splash around them. Then, the pressure stopped, and she felt herself suspended in water, with Jeremy's hand holding hers. He urged her upward, and she looked up and saw light. Virginia began to kick. Her legs and arms felt heavier with the thick slime still covering her body, but she managed to finally surface. There she was, in Carroll Creek, a familiar place she used to associate with so many warm memories. She breathed in the air, her slimy baptism complete. Jeremy swam to the edge of the creek and sat wearily. With painful and exhausted groans, Virginia swam over to where he was, and with his help, pulled herself out of the water. She sat next to him, and for a few minutes, neither of them said anything. Virginia at last put her arm around Jeremy's slimy back. She saw the bullets that were still encrusted in the slime there, but miraculously still outside of his cloak. "It's good to see you again, Jeremy," she said.
It's a shame, though,
croaked Jeremy.
We still don't have any good pictures. I could use a hot shower.
Virginia took out her Galaxy phone. As expected, it was dead. "Jeremy, no offense, but you're gonna start needing something a lot stronger than Irish Spring." They both smiled as the sun began to rise on a new day in Frederick, Maryland.